So we have talked before about the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. How if you want low on inflation, you're going to end up with some unemployment. If you want low unemployment, you're going to end up with some inflation. There is an economic model used to examine this relationship and to describe it. That model is called the Phillips curve, and that is pretty much what this entire chapter is about. Now, the relationship is different in the short run and in the long run. There are things that can impact that relationship, that can come into play to throw it out of whack a little bit. There are short run costs to reducing inflation. And we're going to examine a phenomenon that kind of threw the Phillips curve a little loop in the 1990s. Especially during the Clinton administration, when we were in an economic boom, we had both very low inflation and unemployment. And the Phillips curve kind of doesn't allow for that, so we have to examine how that happens. All right. In the long run, they're unrelated. They don't have anything to do with each other in the long run. On what is inflation based? What causes inflation? Literally what we've been doing the past 3 chapters. Increase in the money supply causes inflation. Very good. Now, what determines the natural rate of unemployment? There's a number of factors. Minimum wage. Labor unions, labor supply, okay? What else? What about what kinds of jobs are available? Yeah, all kinds of stuff. So one of our 10 principles tells us that in the short run, economies have a choice to make. Do we go inflation? Do we go low unemployment? But that's a short run thing, because in the long run, no relationship. All right. So we've seen the Phillips curve before. It shows us that trade-off. It's named after a guy, strangely enough, named Phillips, who figured out that there's an inverse relationship between the nominal wage and unemployment. He did this based on United Kingdom data. A couple years later, a couple of American economists studied it and showed that it held true in the US data as well. When they did that, they honored the guy who had shown that correlation first and named their curve the Phillips curve. So how do we get the Phillips curve? Set the price level at 100. Going to show you a couple of graphs. First one, aggregate demand is going to be low. Okay? Means there's going to be very little increase in the price level, which means that we've got low inflation, which means pretty low output, which correlates with high unemployment. If we had low unemployment, we'd be producing more. Right? Then another one where we look at aggregate demand being high, which will mean that we'll have a significant increase in the price level. We're going to have high output, and low unemployment. So here's your short run aggregate supply. We're going to do the low demand one. So our price level, remember we started at 100, now it's 103. Okay. Carry that over, and you end up with an unemployment rate of 6%, correlated with inflation of 3%.
How do you know which percent to put down?
They're giving it to you.
Oh.
They're giving it to you. Okay. So now let's look at the second scenario where we have high demand. and low unemployment. So there's our high demand right there. Okay. Price level, significant increase. Much higher inflation and a lower unemployment rate. When you connect those 2 points on the right-hand graph, that's where you get the Phillips curve. And it is labeled PC, capital P, capital C, Phillips curve. It is important that you know inflation and unemployment rate are the axis labels on a Phillips curve graph. If you don't label those correctly, curve will be out of whack. All right. Read this.
On the last one, it's here, was the aggregates being low or high?
So we have both fiscal and monetary policy to throw at any economy, right? So the Phillips curve, in illustrating the relationship between inflation and unemployment, gives us, theoretically, what they're calling a menu of choices. If you have low unemployment and high inflation, you have low inflation and high unemployment, or you pick something in between and you attempt to achieve that result by affecting aggregate demand through fiscal and monetary policy. Trying to lock the Legos together here, folks. This is kind of it, putting it all together. All right. In the 60s, the data absolutely supported everything that these economists had said. It looked like the Phillips curve was a completely reliable tool.
It depends.
Okay. So during the 60s, policymakers said, we're going to cut unemployment. We'll deal with high inflation. It won't last, was kind of their mentality. We're going to cut unemployment. Look in 1961 there on the right. Unemployment was pretty high. It was about 7%. That's rough. That's rough. So they did everything they could to get unemployment down. And they did. They succeeded in lowering the unemployment rate pretty significantly. They more than cut it in half over the decade. But look at what they did to inflation. From about 1% or just over 1% to over 4%. That was a shock to folks. They were not accustomed to inflation that high. All right. In the long run, the Phillips curve ends up being vertical. Because Milton Friedman, we've heard his name before, right? And his buddy said, you know what? This trade-off between unemployment and inflation is just a short-term thing. It doesn't exist in the long run. They said that eventually and always unemployment will return to its natural rate. And they said that since there is a natural rate of unemployment, then that means that you're never going to be able to get unemployment completely to go away, no matter how much you try. so that in the long run the Phillips curve doesn't exist as a curve, but it is a vertical line. You will find remarkable similarity when you see this next slide between the long run Phillips curve and the long run what are our axis labels on the long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph? What's on the y-axis? Price level, and on the x-axis? Output. Okay. What's on the y-axis of a Phillips curve graph? And on the x-axis? Okay. So if we throw aggregate demand in here, if we grow aggregate demand in the long run, unemployment isn't going to change. What is going to change? Inflation. There is a correlation betwixt them. Okay, but all that's theory. Does it prove out? Does the data support this theory? Well, in the 60s, the Phillips curve slopes downward. But according to Friedman and friends, it's going to be vertical in the long run. So how do we go from this to this? Where is that transition? Oh, sorry. So we have to deal with what we call expected inflation. This is where we get our forecasted inflation. Remember, what do we expect inflation to be generally? 1 to 2%. 2% is usually figured to be pretty good. Okay. Because when you can tell people how much prices are going to go up over time, they adjust to it. They even things out. You can predict because the money supply is in our control. The other factors aren't, but you can predict at least a blank % increase. There's an equation. Classwork has to tolerate. So what we're doing today with everybody is limiting the illustrative part of it. So we're just working on the assembly. Putting it together, making sounds, and reading. Huh? So today you said how Thank you.
No problem.
So in the short run, the Fed can increase the money supply more than they had planned. They can make inflation more than they expected to and bring that unemployment rate down. In the long run, though, as they say here, expectations catch up to reality. the unemployment rate is gonna go back to that natural rate, regardless of how much the Fed increased money supply. So, is there a fix? Can we truly control the unemployment rate? It depends is actually not the right answer. The right answer is no. Because natural unemployment exists. You cannot overcome that. It's insurmountable. Okay. So we have, let's do this. We have our initial situation. Okay. We expected inflation to be 3%. We expect unemployment to be 6%. There's where we're at. Okay. Let's say that the Fed decides they don't like inflation at 3%. They want to, or they don't like unemployment, at 6%. It's too high. They want to bring it down. So they're going to increase inflation more than expected. They move it out down to, they move inflation up to 5%, which brings in unemployment down to 4%. Yay, Fed wins, right? Except that 6% really wants to be the natural unemployment rate. So what's going to happen?
Go back.
What goes back?
Unemployment rate.
But inflation will stay high and the curve will move.
Inflation will stay high, so what's the graph going to look like? The Phillips curve is going to shift upwards. We end up back at the natural unemployment rate, and now we also have higher inflation. Well, that's not quite where we wanted to end up, is it?
I think you're fitting next time.
Frozen cave and he cuts himself out. Well, this isn't any better.
Let's work through it. Okay. Natural rate of unemployment is 5%. Expected inflation is 2%. In our Phillips curve equation, we're going to make A 0.5. So let's plot the long run Phillips curve.
Easy one.
Exactly. So you ask Yelpy and volunteer me for the holidays.
Pressure.
Good up there we go. Put the label up the top, please. LRPC.
Does that L move to your standard share?
Yeah, close enough.
No,
We're not-
it looks like.
What does it say?
Well, then
No,
you-
that's, all it's supposed to do is just on the long run.
That marker.
But yeah, but
that-
remember, you can use your filter right there.
All right, does this look like an accurate long run Phillips curve to you?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Who's our next victim? I mean volunteer.
Everyone want to volunteer right away? Sure. Okay.
All right, Andrew, your next step is here. What is the unemployment rate? You're gonna have to do some math.
Oh, I think he's just gonna leave.
No, he's getting his equation.
I thought he was just being dramatic and was like, never mind, I don't want to volunteer.
I mean, I could have done that. It's just you know, it's way out.
4x.
Percent. Unemployment rate.
Your percent sign is tilted 90 degrees.
Oh, it's the wrong way.
There you go. Okay.
Hey, Jared.
Did you just say his math isn't right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's yes.
Yeah.
I didn't do the negative.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Was
that an 11?
It is an 11.
That's an equal sign. It's an equals going down. So like that's where the rate
You
would
need
be.
parallel. Parallel.
It's unnecessary.
It's in geometry.
But-
Vertically is the line.
All right.
Not that line.
So let's work through this for the math impaired.
Wait, you forgot to sketch the short run.
Wait, let's work through it for the math impaired. What is the equation to do this?
It's a natural rate of unemployment.
Natural rate of unemployment minus
A times the actual
minus the,
Expected to.
so 5 minus 0.5 times -2. So 5 minus
negative 1.
-1, 6. So his math on the first one is right. Now, this becomes a 6, becomes 4, 5 minus 2 is 3. All right, so those are accurate.
Wait, why'd you cross out?
Yeah, why'd you cross out the?
Because I was doing the second equation, I
Oh,
changed
okay.
it. All right,
Maybe it's.
so sketch our short run Phillips curve. Don't just draw a curve, use the numbers you came up with. Uber?
Yeah, I understand.
You have 2 unemployment rates to draw. That's all you have. Or 2.
Yeah.
All right. How do you feel about that?
Good enough.
There's apparently no feeling in the classroom, Andrew.
Good enough.
My bad.
We can't see that.
It's a 2.
There you go.
Seriously.
All right. How do you feel about it now?
Good enough.
Okay.
It looks
it should be hitting the 6 right, like it should be touching the graph at 6, not like hovering over it.
So you think it should be down always?
Yes, because when that was when
Oh, yeah.
Now it's out. And is your slope right? Because you have 2 different inflation things, so you can make the graph the right way. You have 2 different points in the graph.
At 6% inflation,
Because you have 6 0 as a point. And
that's why I said don't just go drawing a line, give yourself actual points on the graph. Yeah, but you need to correlate that to the y-axis. So bring your 6 across from there.
what?
From that
There's a
unemployment
6%
rate.
on the inflation side. You
6%
don't have it.
inflation
Yeah,
correlates to
so
3%. There you go. Close enough. All right.
We tried.
Who's next?
Anyone want to volunteer?
Put up that question first.
Nope.
Chelsea, Pizza Man.
Dayton just volunteered or got voluntold.
My mom thinking he never delivers. Get it?
Since Pizza Man.
Casey says.
All right.
Dang it.
Now the expected inflation has gone up to 4%. Do it again.
Just change the 0.
We're gonna do it purple this time.
I know David's starting.
Math over here.
Do I have to actually do the math if I already know it?
Not everybody in here does.
Oh.
So talk through the equation. What's that?
That's the national rate of unemployment.
What's that?
That's A.
What's that?
That's the actual. That's expected.
Okay. And then you have to do it for
Yeah.
6. Okay.
Yeah.
So what's our Phillips curve look like?
You ready to draw on this thing?
What did we just calculate here? Is this unemployment or inflation or what? These numbers, these 7 and 4.
That's the unemployment.
Okay. So at 7% unemployment, what's
Do you
inflation?
want me to draw a new?
Yes.
It's purple
No, you
sucks.
gotta put it on the same graph.
Oh.
I want you to draw a new curve, not a new graph. At 7% inflation,
Yeah.
or sorry, 7% unemployment, what's inflation?
0.
And at 4% unemployment, what's inflation?
What was it? 4. Wow, this is a pretty accurate graph right here. Whoa.
So they shouldn't actually intersect. They should be parallel. Yeah. Andrews was a little off because he didn't plot his points and then draw his line.
I'm confused.
Wait, so Dayton's right or?
The Phillips curve shouldn't intersect.
Then how do you
Give me.
You
Yeah.
draw Andrews' curve correctly first.
27.
So use your blue, use the blue one and fix
Why don't you
Andrews'
just
curve.
restart?
Just erase the initial Phillips curve too.
Yes.
You're just gonna have to hold the lid.
Now hang on. Like that.
There you go. All right.
Parallel.
This is the problem when we have to hand graph and use actual numbers.
So if you find them intersecting, you're doing something wrong.
Yes.
Alright.
We're still not done. One more. Is there a volunteer? Then Dayton, who's the victim?
You left that.
Don't care. Needs to be a readable color though. Erase Dayton's math and do the math over for us. All right, so talk it out. Talk it out. Natural rate fell to 4. You're still dealing with 6 and 0 on the other.
Wait, I don't have to do math. I just have to draw the curve at 4. Don't I? It's long run.
I thought I'd get you.
Psych.
Wow,
Boom.
good job.
Gang.
Gavin is not to be fooled today.
Yeah.
You thought about it a while though.
I know. Wait, makes sense. Should be 2 numbers.
Yeah. Long run Phillips curve has to be vertical. All right, so let's see what they came up with here. How'd we do?
Take the quiz right now. Wow.
Okay. So their numbers were the same. That's what we came up with. Looking good so far. So an increase in the expected inflation moved that Phillips curve to the right, so Dayton was correct. Okay. Then when we adjusted the natural rate of unemployment down, long run Phillips curve shifted to the left. All right. Good. So, let's go back to the actual data and the actual Phillips curve. So here we were in the 60s. Okay, Phillips curve was working. Yes, sir.
Do you want us to reshift it? To ask us to do that? Like in the last column, it reshifted.
Oh, reshifted the other curves. Yes. All right. In the 70s, though, the data broke the curve. Let's look at the 70s data on this same graph.
It's like connecting dots on
The Phillips curve became a Phillips C. We had high inflation and high unemployment.
That's the milk.
We have a problem. Except that we don't have a problem because when you get to 10 years, 12 years out, what do you have? You no longer have short run, you now have, and you're getting much closer to vertical, aren't you?
This is the Phillips constellation.
All right. So, do you see that difference between the short run and the long run then in the actual data?
Yeah.
All right. Now, there's another thing that can mess with the Phillips curve, and it's called a supply shock. It is not the same as an electric chair shock. It's not quite that alarming. Anything that directly alters the costs of production and thus prices will shift aggregate supply and the Phillips curve. So, for instance, I don't know, thinking in the 70s, what if there were an oil embargo and oil prices rose dramatically? That would be a supply shock. Would dramatically alter costs and prices. So what happens to the short run aggregate supply when we get a supply shock? it's going to move to the left. What happens to price level? It's going to go up. What's going to happen to output? Decrease. What's going to happen to unemployment? So there's your shift. Carry that line over. And there's your unemployment rate and resulting Phillips curve. Follow that. This is again where we've got both graphs side for side, so you can carry that line on over. Okay, so let's look at the data behind it. A barrel of oil is about 60 gallons of oil. Okay. Would you say that a 3-time increase is a pretty good shock to the supply? That's significant. Okay. So the Fed said, all right, this is bad. This is a shock. We're just going to dramatically increase the money supply. So they did. So we get much higher expected inflation, which further shifts the Phillips curve.
Does the government still use Phillips curve today?
Yeah. The oil prices did not hold steady. They went up more. Over time. Okay. Then they went up way more. The Fed had increased the money supply already to try to adjust that, and we're hurting for tools to continue to deal with it. So let's look at what these huge supply shocks did to the Phillips curve. Bad news, right? Got inflation down a little bit, but then it went right back up again. Okay. So, what does it cost us to reduce inflation? How do we get inflation down? Well, we don't call it inflation reduction, we call it disinflation. That is an actual economic term. It sounds like a made-up word. Disinflation is reduction of inflation. Do not ever say deflation.
Don't do it.
Disinflation. Deflate is what happens to your pool raft. It's what happens to your hopes and dreams when you get to college. All right. So in order to achieve disinflation, the Fed has to slow the growth of money. That's how you reduce inflation. Slow the growth of money. When you do that, you're going to decrease aggregate demand, which is going to reduce output. Output's going to fall. Unemployment is going to rise in the short run. In the short run. In the long run, what's always going to happen? Output's going to go back where it belongs. Unemployment is going to go back where it belongs. I'm wondering if anything is occurring to you to ask at this point.
If it always goes back, why do they solve?
If it's always going to go back in the long run, why do we mess with it?
Because we don't. They want to get reelected, that's why.
Part of it is politics. Part of it is politics and that incentive to get reelected. Some portion of it is our inability as society to wait. Immediate gratification is a huge thing, right? And remember, what's our time difference between short run and long run?
10
It's a long time. It's a long time. Think about your lifespan. 80 years. That's
80 years.
that's some long runs.
Sticky in a retirement home.
And think about how badly people can be hurt in the short run. So the question becomes for society as a whole, do we want government to be obligated to try to mitigate the short run economic traumas in order to better people's lives? That's an economic and a political decision that you as a voter have to make. Because I promise you, enough homeless people on the streets, as were out there when President Reagan was running for election, publicized on the news, makes who's ever in office and doing nothing about it, homeless mothers with babies on the street, how's that look? And if you as the politician running for election say, trust me, it'll get better in the long run,
Hey, do you know where there's?
but on the other hand,
They're yours.
You're right, so if you said that,
people writing checks and paying taxes,
Oh, they are.
what do they want? Wait for the long run!
Well, they stink.